the brief introduction. All right, we are live. Hi, everyone. This is the Fertile Fireside Chat, and I'm really, really blessed to have an amazing reproductive lawyer, Melissa Brisman, here today. I've known her for many years and is one of the tops in her field, helping those that are working to become a parent, whether it's surrogacy, gestational carrier, or donor eggs, or just understanding the legality about reproductive law and surrogacy. Welcome, Melissa. How are you doing this beautiful day?
I'm great. I'm great. And thank you for having me. So, again, my name is Melissa Brisman, and I have been doing this for 25 years. And
Wow.
basically, I do all kinds of reproductive law: surrogacy, egg donation, sperm donation, adoptions. I help people when they're looking for a gestational surrogate. And I'm licensed in 5 states, including New York, where, CNY is based. So, I'm hoping I can give you some valuable information today.
Well, I think that's what we're looking for, and helping people understand that it is not as difficult as they think. Having an expert like yourself give them some direction and knowledge, which is so important. Who seeks your help, by the way? Who's your primary client that's looking for information to get them on their road for becoming a parent?
So, anybody who's using a gamete donor, egg, sperm, or embryo donor, in which that is obtained from an agency or is a known person, right? So, if you're getting sperm from, let's say, California Cryobank, and you're a heterosexual married couple, you probably don't need a whole lot of legal advice, right? But if you're a same sex couple, especially in this era of our Supreme Court, you probably need some advice on whether or not you need an adoption or something confirmatory, or especially if you're using a known gamete provider or a surrogate. Surrogate, you always need some legal help because you can't show up to a hospital pregnant and say, this is the actual parent. Like, I'm not the mother. This is the actual mother, or these are the actual two dads, because they're not going to put somebody else other than the birth person on the birth certificate without some kind of documentation um, in the process.
When should people seek advice on this? Should they wait till their surrogate or carrier is pregnant, or should they really be seeking it long before that, and even helping them find a carrier?
Well, I like to do everything early, and it's probably partly because I'm a lawyer. I like to have everything done in advance. Obviously, if you don't contact your lawyer before, it's better after than doing nothing. But there are certain things that you can do. For instance, New York law is a little harder when you're doing a surrogacy. There are some requirements that make it much more expensive for the intended parents. So, for example, if you have a paid surrogate in the state of New York, you have to buy her health and life insurance for a year post birth, even if that person has no complications and is completely healthy, right? So you say 3 months post birth, they go to their OBGYN. The OBGYN says they're clear, they look great. You're having to pay for another 9 months of health insurance for them. Now, if the intended parents live in New Jersey, we could have used New Jersey law to do that contract and gotten around the issue of having to buy health insurance after the carrier has given birth and has been cleared. So obviously, in that sense, it would have been better to do it before. Most states require things to be done before to get the parents on the birth certificate in a seamless fashion.
So even if you're using a known carrier, so someone for some reason they either don't have a uterus, or they have a damaged uterus, or they have other medical conditions that's preventing them from becoming pregnant and carrying a baby, they use either their eggs or donor eggs, partner sperm or a donor embryo to place into someone else to carry that baby, deliver that baby, with they themselves being the intended parents. So if it's someone you know, do you have to go through the same uh, stuff? The same?
Absolutely, because first of all, when it's known, it's a little more important, right? Because if it's a sister or a family member, I think it's more important just to talk out what's going to happen. What's going to happen at Thanksgiving? What's going to happen at the holidays, right? And I always tell people, if you're using a family member, that's great. But remember, your family member's traits will be exacerbated, right? So if you found your sister to be a highly annoying, loud person who always needs constant attention, don't expect that to change when she's carrying your baby. So you have to know the family dynamic, right? But also, your sister can't show up at the hospital and say, I'm not the birth person. Don't put me on the birth record, right? We need to have certain procedures in place. Also, the biggest thing is that it is not so much in New York, because New York law doesn't allow um, health insurance companies that are meeting certain criteria to exclude surrogate pregnancies. But some states, you're allowed to have health insurance or an employee benefit plan that says, if you're not if you're not having this baby for yourself, in other words, you're carrying it with a preconception intent to give it away, we're not going to pay for this pregnancy, right? And then if that person has twins and the birth is $1 million, we're going to have a huge problem if someone hasn't looked at that insurance.
So if you're having a transfer in New York at one of the CMI fertility centers, but you're delivering in another state, which laws are superseded, or both?
So you really want to make sure that you look at the law, because you have a lot of choices, right? So you could either use the law where the person is delivering the baby, where the person carrying the baby lives, and sometimes where the intended parents live. So you want to look at the where is it going to be easiest to get your name on the birth certificate and the least expensive, and what is going to be the best. So New York law is more onerous for the parents, and it is very generous to the surrogate, right? So there's 5 things about New York law where if a carrier is delivering in New York, you have to use New York law if the carrier is delivering there and the parents don't live in a surrogate friendly state. So if the parents are in a surrogate friendly state, New York will accept an order from another state. So I try to avoid New York if I can for parents who are on any kind of budget, right? Because they have to pay for this year of life insurance, a year of health insurance. Um, the carrier has a lot of control over things that she might not have control over in other states. They have to pay lost wages. This is not the same for a non compensated surrogate, though. If you have a non compensated surrogate in New York, that person can waive a lot of these extra expenses. New York law happens to be one of the most complicated. Surrogacy agencies also have to be licensed. That's the only state in the United States where they have to be licensed.
That New York State does make it a little onerous for those in this. They didn't have the laws for so long, and then they made them, and they made them the most onerous.
Yeah.
Surprise.
Yeah. Well, what happened was the law was passed during COVID. So I was on the committee that wrote the law. And basically, this was one of Cuomo's pet projects. But the only way he could get the law in was to allow a lot of senators to have input in the law who had no knowledge of actually how a surrogacy arrangement works, or what reproductive law is, or what reproductive medicine is. So you have a lot of politicians making changes, and a lot of those changes make no sense. For instance, in New York, the couple who is receiving the baby can't be from a foreign country because they were afraid of baby trafficking, right? So this is obviously a very cumbersome process, no matter what, for baby trafficking. That would be an unusual way to use the fertility model.
The risk. I mean, baby M. I can't remember long ago where they had some issues with the who
Transferring custody.
transferring custody. Is that really a big problem today?
No, first of all, baby M was the woman carrying the baby used her own egg. So it was an artificial insemination, right? So very few people do that today. They use a donor egg or their own, the intended mother's egg. So I've been doing this, since 1998. I've probably been involved in more than 10,000 cases. I have never had a carrier try to keep the baby. The kinds of problems we have really are the ones that people don't think of, right? So most of the time when people do this, they're spending a lot of money, right? So they're, mortgaging their home, they're saving, and they've waited a long time for this baby. And usually people who have carried babies for other people, unless it's like a sister or something, just have very easy pregnancies. They get pregnant easily. They're also not worriers, right? They're carrying a baby for a stranger for money and taking different kinds of medicine. So they're very laid back, right? So you have like a very nervous person or persons who are going to get the baby and a super laid back person. So the kinds of problems you have are like, did she take her vitamins? Did she take her medicine on time? What is she eating? How do I know she hasn't become a crack cocaine addict overnight? And a lot of times it's just personality, right? So a laid back person may take 24 hours to call you back. Meanwhile, the intended parents are like, what happened to her? It's been 24 hours. Where she has 4 kids. Nothing happened to her. She's busy.
But you would say that this is really becoming mainstream in the reproductive world, where maybe at one point it was rare, it's now common. And would you say it's easier than people think it is?
Absolutely, especially if you have someone guiding you in the process, right? So there are 3 things I always tell people that are hard about this. And some I can't control, right? Like I can't control what a carrier is charging, right? So if you have to get a paid carrier, how much you have to pay her, that's a burden, right? Like if you have to pay somebody between 30 and $50,000 to carry your baby, that the cost is a factor. Your emotions, right? So that's if you're worried every night if the baby's going to be healthy, right? That's something that I can't control. And the time, right? So it takes time to make embryos, like it takes time to put them in somebody's uterus, and babies take approximately 40 weeks to come out of the womb. So those are really the hard parts. Everything else, the science, pregnancy, it's just a pregnancy, right? It's a normal pregnancy once she gets pregnant.
And what percentage are using a known carrier versus they're not anonymous, but an agency paid carrier?
So I would say that 90% use an unknown carrier, but not everybody uses an agency these days. A lot of people have found, so if you're your average income American, sometimes using an agency is more expensive, and you can use things like Facebook groups, matching groups, and there's also now these website matching programs. The big thing about that to me is it always, because I work at an agency too, founded an agency, there's you can basically find your carrier in the supermarket. The big issue is you have to do the same steps, right? So we do a criminal background check on any carrier we find. If you find somebody on Facebook, we still want to do a criminal background check on her, right? We still want to make sure if she said she had 3 babies, that she actually had 3 babies. For the first time in my career, we had somebody find a carrier on Facebook, and once we got her medical records, the carrier was HIV positive. So obviously HIV positive people can have babies, but that is not somebody you would want to use as a carrier, right? So
Right.
she obviously didn't disclose this. So we have to obviously look at her medical records wherever she's coming from. So there's no issue where you find the carrier. I've had people's mothers find the carrier for them at the library, believe it or not. Like you just have this mother that wants a grandbaby so bad, she tells everybody she could possibly know, my daughter needs a carrier. And then she finds her someone. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that as long as it's a good candidate.
So more and more people are beginning to do the search for themselves, but agency surrogacy searches are probably still the most common that people are using. And so if the carrier is in a state that doesn't have any laws regarding this, is it's still important to create a contractual agreement? Is that what you're saying? Or some sort of a
Absolutely, because right, if you let's say you go into a state like Pennsylvania, which is a great state for surrogacy, right? But it doesn't have any laws on the books, but it has regulations from the Department of Health how to get your name on it, and it has a Supreme Court case that says the contract is enforceable, right? So if you don't have a contract, you're just going to have consents from the clinic and testimony. It's going to drag out and cost a lot of money. Where if you have a contract, the court is just going to rule on the contract, right? It's an enforceable contract, the court has said. So you have to make sure, right? And a contract also isn't only for court, it's a lay of the land, right? So if I go through the contract with my client and I say, what's her view on abortion? And they say, oh my God, I haven't spoken to her about that. and then we send her the contract and she says, I won't abort for any reason, I'm pro-life, then we realize like this is not a good candidate because the client wants to have an abortion if the baby has a birth defect. So it helps with a lot of things. I even put in things how often people are going to talk, because I put in at least twice a month they'll have a FaceTime or a Zoom call, or will they be allowed to Zoom into doctor's appointments, because people don't think of those things. And then maybe the carrier doesn't want them Zooming in, or maybe she is going to be uncomfortable if they don't at least call into some appointments. And how's she going to feel if they're in the delivery room? So it's a good guide for how the process might go as well.
What about other areas so donor egg, donor sperm, even anonymous from a bank? There are laws that are changing in now or in the future. Is it still a good idea to seek out some counsel on what type of things you may not think about and may come about in the future?
Absolutely. Like, for instance, at least, so two of the most common things I have in my law practice that people don't realize. So when I started doing this, there was no such thing as 23andMe or Ancestry DNA, or so I get calls all the time about people who found out that their parents had a child through some kind of donor bank or
Mhm.
donor egg or donor sperm, or their parents had an affair and they didn't realize it. But um, so they find each other in these ways, or their kid found out about something or had a disease. So, these are things that not everybody, we think it's common sense, right? Because we
Right.
talk about it every day, but people don't realize that their kid is probably going to find out if they're not genetically related to them, right? That's important. And then another thing that people don't realize is that if they don't divorce their spouse and they haven't been separated for a certain period of time, and then they have a baby with a new partner, there are legal ramifications to this, especially in a reproductive clinic. So every week I'm getting a call about, this one is 38 years old and her eggs are really old and she split up a year ago and she wants to have a baby with this new partner. You can, under New York law, you can do that. But you have to meet the statutory requirements, which is you have to have a legal separation agreement, counsel on both sides, and you have to make sure that the current husband in advance, there is a signed document that he's not going to be the father. Or under the law in New York, he's presumptively the father.
Right. Right. So it's all the things people don't think about before they go into it. I imagine even for those people that are just standardly going into a relationship to be married and or have children together, it might be something to think about. How do you handle separation, divorce prior to having your children?
Yeah, well, that's a prenup agreement that a
Right.
lot of people have and is a good idea. But even if you're just a married heterosexual couple making embryos, like under New York law, you can make a disposition. This is actually one of the only states, and a good law in New York is that you can make an enforceable disposition agreement on your embryos, right? So you can make an agreement that if you split up with your husband, you, let's say, made embryos because you had cancer. You can make an agreement that if you split up with your husband, those embryos are yours and he won't be the father, right? So that's a huge concern sometimes. Like if a cancer patient made embryos instead of freezing eggs, and now she's divorced and this is her only chance to have a baby, it used to be that the ex-husband would still be the legal father and have to pay child support. Now you can make an agreement that he has essentially donated his sperm to you. And
Which,
that's very important, and you want to make sure that agreement is enforceable and you do it the right way.
which requires legal counsel to make sure that it's done properly, not just a backroom piece of paper that you're writing and making an agreement and not properly
Yeah,
consenting.
because New York law requires in those agreements, each person has to have an independent attorney. So somebody explains to the husband what he's giving away and make sure he understands it. And he can't claim after the divorce is that he didn't understand it, right? So we don't want that agreement to be attacked. Especially if somebody can't get any more eggs.
So even though they might sign a consent and write in disposition, they really require the legal counsel separately in order to define that.
Yes, absolutely, or it's not enforceable. The consent, the consent can be changed at any time, whereas an enforceable, what they call embryo disposition agreement under New York law, it could be changed. Obviously, the parties could decide to amend it, but it can't be attacked in the same way a consent is, because what the law thinks is that when you're signing those consents, you're really reading 10 or 20 pages and not really thinking about it. I could tell you, so all my kids are born from surrogates. That's how I got started in this. And when you say it increased, in my first year, I did 10 cases. And now there are some years where we're having 200-300 babies just from surrogacy, not to mention the egg donations. But I remember filling out the form, and my husband, who was a medical resident at the time, doesn't even know what's on the form, right? He probably signed it, post call. And so they really want to make sure people are thinking about what they sign.
What we don't understand, but we sign it anyway. In so many ways of our lives, we should probably have lawyers read everything, and even the point where just the consents through reproductive, through everything we do, really should be reviewed by your counsel.
I do go over those a lot of times, and more important, it isn't just reviewing them by counsel; it's actually reading them. Right? You want a baby so bad, you just sign whatever somebody puts in front of you. You don't really want to think about. So when I talk to people about having a baby, and we give people, like on our website, we actually give free 2-hour consultations about everything that we're going over. People don't think about what's going to happen when the baby is 10 years old. It's no longer a baby, right? So
Right.
people will come to me and say, I don't want to tell people that I'm using a surrogate. First of all, I say, why? Half the world is using a surrogate. And two, you weigh 110 pounds and you're 5'2". Eventually, if you have no pictures of yourself pregnant, everybody around you knows you weren't pregnant. Eventually, this child will find out and will be angry that you lied to them, right? So kids don't usually mind when you tell them things when they're little. So my kids were born from a surrogate when nobody did this, and they never minded. It was the adults that minded, right?
Hmm. I recently ran into a 17-year-old who called me because he was interested in my flying of airplanes, and he happened to find out that he was conceived through my clinic, and but he didn't know how he was conceived. And we chatted about it. And he said, "Well, let me call my mom." And he was conceived through donor eggs, and no one blinked an eye. It was just sort of a matter of fact. It was a-okay, but not everyone would take it that way, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, some people care more about certain things. So, like, my son could have cared less that he was born through a surrogate. My daughter, when she was 8, asked to meet the surrogate. So I called her up and we took a trip, and she went bowling with her and she had fun. And then after that, she didn't, but she asked her very unusual questions that kids would ask. My mom makes me eat string beans. Do you like string beans? Did you eat peanut butter? Because I don't really like peanut butter. And she thought somehow like what she ate would, form her taste buds. And then after that, she didn't ask any more questions. It was like her curiosity was satisfied. And then she went on. So, each kid is different. I asked my son so many times, he said he didn't want to hear about it anymore.
It's important to some and not important to others. But for people going through the process of surrogacy carriers, using donor eggs, donor sperm, donor embryos, it is important that they gain information ahead of time so they can understand the pitfalls and the bumps in the road, and hopefully smooth them out before they get there.
Yeah, and to me, the most important thing is, like, let's say you had breast cancer and you used a donor because you have the BRCA gene and you didn't want to screen out and worry about it. So you just used a donor egg. You don't really want your kid growing up thinking that they're going to get cancer, right? Like, that's a scary. So if they come to the realization that you have that gene and that they might have it, it might be nice to be able to tell them, hey, you don't have my genes. I carried you. I love you. You're my child, but you don't have to worry about getting this cancer.
What about out of country? And I know New York has certain laws. We have clinics in Florida and in Colorado, which interesting enough, New York State is getting us our Colorado office certified for New York, which means we have to follow the same rules in Colorado as we do in New York, which is kind of interesting. But for people coming from out of the country, what is your general approach and recommendations for these individuals or couples?
Well, if they're carrying the baby themselves, they just have to worry really about US law mostly. Um, But if they're using a surrogate, I have to make sure a couple of things. One, I have to have the surrogate give birth in a state where I can get the birth certificate rather quickly and it's legal, right? So, for instance, if they gave birth in New York, even though they're not allowed to use a surrogate in New York if they're from out of the country, it doesn't mean that it's illegal. It means what will happen is it will be a longer process, right? And already it takes New York 3 or 4 months to print a birth certificate from a surrogacy arrangement.
Hmm.
So forget about going home quickly, right? So that's out anyway. Same thing with Virginia. So I have to see A, how quickly can I get this person a birth certificate and a passport, right? Then B, I have to make sure with the home state or home country that what is the order to get their names on the birth certificate have to look like, and what do they have to do to get this baby status. Like in England, they have to get a parental order in England to bring the baby, to get the baby English citizenship, and there are certain things that the court must rule and I must provide. So I have to talk to counsel in their home country if they're using a surrogate, which you would think is a pain, but now it's a lot easier because of the internet. And so in most big countries, like I'll have a contact in France, I have a contact in Spain, I have a contact in New Zealand and Australia. Now, if you're going to Macedonia, that might be a little different, right? It might take a little bit more, but usually I can find somebody in every country to make sure that it's done properly.
And so there are a lot more people that are creating embryos out of the country and then using a carrier out of the country, which again, the laws in those countries supersede, but we want to make sure these things are happening well ahead of time.
Yeah, I mean, using somebody abroad is way more complicated than somebody coming over here. Because a lot of times when people go to another country, they're going to an underdeveloped country for cost savings. And there are always huge risks with that. Like I have been involved in cases. So in Nepal, there was an earthquake, right? And then a lot of the babies died. And actually, a lot of Israelis went there, and the Israeli government had to get involved and, take them. And then what's going on in Ukraine with surrogacy is, horrible because of the war. So if you have no other choice but to go abroad, but if you can afford it or make it work here, in my opinion, it's never worth the risk to go to an underdeveloped country.
How about Mexico? Are there many people going to Mexico for surrogacy?
People do go there, and the issue there is that, and I had this happen once. Now, I don't do the legal work, but sometimes I help with certain things when the baby comes back, is that if the baby is born early, the care there is just not as good as it is here.
Hmm.
So, yes, everything can go great in Mexico and it can be a lot cheaper. But sometimes the fertility clinics are not as good, not always, but you'd have to know where to go. And then we did have a baby born early who had severe disabilities that the pediatrician here thought if the baby was born here, they would have had access to better care.
So that's an important thing to know about well ahead of making your decision of who to use and where to get the resources. And you're trying to save a little bit of money or a lot of money, but it may be money that was ill spent.
Yes, and sometimes people try to make their embryos abroad and bring them here because they feel like it's cheaper, and they don't realize they'll go use a donor egg abroad who make the embryos abroad, and there was no FDA testing on the donor, so we can't use embryos here.
And that's a good point. Some states, New York is harder to do that, but other states are beginning to allow that as long as they're properly screened. Are you seeing more and more embryos and or eggs shipped to the United States, and do you handle that?
Yes, but that's the issue. They have to have the proper screening. So a lot of people will create the embryos with the donor, not have the proper blood testing, and then pay for those embryos. And if it's an anonymous donor and we can't get her back to have the testing, then they can't bring the embryos here. So that if they're working with a reputable place who has the FDA testing done, then it's fine to bring the embryos here. Like, not every clinic will accept them, but also sometimes it depends. Sometimes they waste their money making their embryos abroad if they didn't use a clinic who knew how to freeze them properly.
Right.
Right? Because you could defrost embryos as well as the next guy, but if the embryos were frozen improperly, then you're not going to, like, if they weren't vitrified well, there's going to be nothing when you thaw them out.
So that would be another reason to seek advice before you go abroad for either a carrier or donor eggs or a donor embryo that you want to be shipped here, or you want to go out to those places. So a reproductive lawyer may be able to help you with these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always tell people they have to take into account certain costs that you may not take into account here, right? So if you have a baby in the United States and you have to take care of it, right? You might be able to work, right? You could get a babysitter come in. If you can't leave the Ukraine for 6 weeks, that's 6 weeks that, unless you're working remotely, you're not going to be able to go to work. Right? So you have to take into account the lost wages, the flight over there, the hotels, right? Most of the time, if a baby's born in the US and you're going to another US city, 24 hours, that hospital has you out of there. Like, you're going home.
And what are the in the United States, or New York in particular, in general, are you seeing more single, more couples, gay, lesbian? You're seeing everyone, I imagine.
Absolutely. The biggest increase, though, in the population in the last 10 years are definitely, though, gay couples, right? Because there's been an emergence of gay and lesbian rights and marriages, and when people get married, then they have babies. So you do see a whole lot. Actually, our biggest growth is really in the gay and also single women. A lot more single women decide to have babies, and so it's a big growth within the lesbian community and single women donor sperm, and people wanting to know their donor, which I think is okay. But the biggest problem with finding their donor on Facebook is that then they don't go to a clinic. They'll do a home insemination. And right, I imagine if somebody comes to you with a donor, you test that donor for diseases, right? Make sure they don't have syphilis, right? Because that could be very dangerous, or God forbid, a carrier of cystic fibrosis. And then so I think the issue isn't that more and more people are using known donors. It's that they're not taking your sound advice and having them screened. And there's legal problems with doing home inseminations also. They can be declared the father. So
is that something that they can go through the consents and the proper legal counsel in order to waive the rights of that donor?
Yes, but they have to do it correctly. Like, some states like New York do not allow home inseminations. So if you do a home, I guess, unless the doctor makes house calls, it has to be done under the supervision of a doctor. So if a doctor isn't supervising the insemination, the donor's rights are not cut off.
Interesting. So those that are doing home inseminations with the neighbor, friend, or but could be, I guess, anonymous, even if someone else delivers the sperm, potentially, these are all things that people need to be aware of before they get to that spot, because the legal world may deem that donor not a donor, but a parent, essentially.
Yeah, they deem them a dad. And that's very scary, right? Because let's say the donor lives in California and you live in New York, and then you go to court and the donor is determined to be the dad, right? Where's the kid going to live, right? The court isn't going to, if the court determines him to be the dad, the court's going to look at the best interest of the child. And if the child would have a better life and a better home in California, then all of a sudden your child's living in California and you live in New York. That's not at all what you signed up for, when you could have, for under $1,000, had this done way before the child was born. And once you get into legal battles cross country, you could be looking at tens of thousands.
So for those that are interested in advice, what are you said you have a initial no charge consultation? Or how is it charged, and how do you start? How does a client come to you, and what type of expenses just to find out the information?
Sure. Well, we never charge for initial consultation, so they can come and meet. So they would just go to one of our websites, which is Reproductive Lawyer or Reproductive Possibilities. But also, if you do melissabrisman.com, they direct you there, and you would just, either call or send an email, and you would get probably more information than you want for free, like articles and pages, and then you would have a consultation with one of our staff, and depending on what it's about, is how, like, if you wanting us to find a surrogate and do all the legal work, you'd have a free 2-hour consultation, right? If you're talking about donor sperm, it could be, a half an hour, right? Depending on how many. But we never charge to give out free information. And you can range the gamut in fees. Legal work, believe it or not, is the least expensive thing, right? From a sperm donor is any legal work in this process is usually like 500 to 1500, unless you're getting into the surrogacy area, where it could be up to, 3,000 to do something with the surrogacy. The big expenses are if you go to an agency and have that agency do everything in a surrogacy, right? So you could be looking at a $30,000 agency fee if the agency is doing everything. And unfortunately now, surrogates are getting about 40,000 for a first-time surrogate. So before you get out of the gate, you're at $80,000, right? I tell most people a surrogacy is going to be a minimum of 100,000, and you can go up to crazy amounts of money just like anything else, right? So
Right.
you tell me you want a Harvard-educated egg donor who has, a perfect SAT score, and you want to go to some agency out in California to find it, and you pay her 100,000 for your eggs, right? But you certainly don't need to. Then I certainly have people who use their sister to carry the baby, have full insurance coverage for and spend less than $10,000, right? Sperm donor agreements are, $1,000 from start to finish. They're not really hard, but they're very important, right? You want to make sure that the donor is not a dad, right? And the biggest thing is you don't want to have sex with your donor. People say that we had a donor agreement, and then if you could think of it, it's happened. So they have a donor agreement. They come to me, they pay me $1,000 to do the donor agreement, but then they go have sex with their donor. And there's a dispute in court. This has happened. Dispute in court, and they say, well, XYZ lawyer wrote a donor agreement. And then the judge goes, well, if the two of you had sex, that makes it void. It does. I tell all my clients, you can't have sex with your donor. That doesn't work in the United States. If you have sex with someone and get them pregnant, you're the parent.
Right. So that's very important for people to know and get advice well ahead of time if they're thinking about parenthood through surrogacy, donor egg, donor sperm, donor embryo, or if they have any questions about their reproductive rights, they should talk to someone like yourself.
Yes, and also they should look at the cost. Like, you have your in-house lab. It's very affordable a lot of times to go to your clinic, and people think about doing it at home versus going to your clinic, and they're making a very bad choice based on finances that down the road it's going to be a hell of a lot more money, right? If they have a problem, and they think when they're having a baby now that everything's going to be fine, and maybe it is, right? But is it worth the risk? Like, is it worth the risk that somebody could take away your baby?
Critical that you get the information. Anything that you think, any other stories that we haven't talked about, or particular situations you think are important?
Yeah, so I think that when you go through this process, the biggest thing, whether it's a donor is that people don't want to talk to a social worker or a psychologist that is involved with this process. They're spending so much money, and they think, first, they don't want to pay for their lawyer, which I get. Nobody wants to pay for their lawyer. And then they don't want to pay for their social worker, right? And especially if they're sisters. Now, I understand not wanting to do that, but the most times that I have ever had problems with any sort of case emotionally is always with family, right? So if your sister is going to carry your baby, she's going to be in your life, hopefully for the rest of your life. So if you've got a lesbian couple and one person's going to give the sperm, those people are going to be with you forever. 1 hour of social work time usually is not breaking the bank. And most people go to it, and after they do it, they tell me how helpful it was. Because a joint meeting sometimes gets out a lot of feelings and maybe makes a game plan that you could tell people that you can't tell them in a family setting. Like, what I'm most nervous about is that every Thanksgiving you're going to say you gave birth to this baby and how lucky I am. Or, I'm really scared that, a lot of times maybe it's two sisters and they're fine, but the husband is like, I'm really scared that if you're out of work, we're not going to be able to pay for this. I'm happy. And then all you have to do is buy her a disability policy, right? Like, a lot of things can be solved in a joint meeting and save a lot of heartache down the road. So I really like those joint meetings because I'm a lawyer. I'm not a psychologist, and nobody would describe me as warm and fuzzy, right? That's like not my role. And so when you start fighting with your sister, I can't talk to your sister. I'm not allowed legally. I can't have a joint meeting. So I feel that sometimes the social workers are a lot more helpful than people give them credit for.
Hmm. So getting some social worker or psychotherapy, and again, just to be able to talk is helpful, but the legal counsel sort of puts it all down in a way that people can have a plan, a game plan to move forward.
Yeah, the legal work isn't so you can go to court. I can't even count on my hand how many times I can go to court. It's a plan that people don't think about. Like, are you wanting her to pump her breast milk? Where are you going to stand in the delivery room? Like, maybe the husband wants you behind her shoulders, right? Like, are you going to be in the delivery room? What if it's an emergency C-section? What's going to happen, right? If it's donor sperm, how are you going to refer to this? This is your aunt, not your mother, right? Like, it's just a lot of things. If I'm a brother and I donate sperm to my sister's partner, like, what happens if they get divorced? Where does my sperm go, right? Like, just things you don't think about. Or what happens if you have leftover sperm? I don't want you giving it to a third party. I just gave it to you, right? I want to make sure that this person refers to me as an uncle and not a dad, right? I want to make sure my kids know or they don't know. Like, all these things that you're not thinking about, I'm giving you a guide about what to think about.
What type of things in the future do you think we should see in reproductive law regarding all areas of reproduction?
Well, I think that right now it's very hard with the political climate. So certain things that we could do easily are a lot harder, right? So if we have a carrier in Texas now, we can't even write about abortion in the contract,
Hmm.
right? And if a person needs one, they have to go, to another state, right? So if let's just say they have a baby that's severely deformed and it's 13 weeks and is not going to be able to live outside the womb. Even though the law might allow that abortion, no one's doing it in Texas. They
Right.
got to go to another state. So it would be obviously nice if our political climate changed. But I also think that in reproductive medicine, we have to have some uniformity with these laws about donor sperm and donor egg. And we have to have states, understand what it means to have a family, because they don't understand. They make these laws like you can't destroy embryos in Louisiana because they call them people, right? And what's going to happen someday? We're going to have so many frozen embryos. We're going to have no place to put them if we can never destroy them. Like, there's a lack of understanding between the politicians and the doctors.
And it's likely a chasm that's not going to be come together quite easily, because this is has so many rifts in it that we likely won't agree. But ultimately, family building is such a critical, important part of all of our lives. We want to work to make it more affordable, easier for those that are suffering in ways that they can't carry a baby, or they need donor eggs, donor sperm, or donor embryos. How can people find you, Melissa?
The easiest way probably is to go to our website, which again is Reproductive Lawyer, Reproductive Possibilities, melissabrisman.com. They can call, which is, 201-505-0099 or 0078. Most people use the internet to make an appointment now, but they're certainly welcome to call. We are actually in person, in office staff.
Real people.
Yes, absolutely.
And so those that are looking for donor eggs, donor sperm, donor embryos, or a surrogate, a gestational carrier, someone to carry a baby for them, those are the main areas that you work in.
Yes, absolutely. I help with all aspects of, anything reproductive. I do some adoptions, but I don't find the baby or anything, of that nature.
So if someone needs the legal help in working on their adoption, or just some counseling on which way to go, your team is the place to go.
Yes, hopefully we'll see some increase in babies available for adoption, but that's very hard in the US right now. There's very few babies available.
I wonder if the no abortion in certain places is changing that at all. Do you think, or
I
not?
think it might change it a little, but I don't see. I think a lot of people will go to another state or order an abortion pill, and a lot of them will choose to parent the baby that they have. So I don't know if it will change it that much, but you'd have to change the attitudes, and also, unfortunately, not a lot of other countries like the US, so it's hard to get a baby from abroad. Like, they've closed doors. Like, you can't get a baby from Russia anymore, you can't get a baby from Ukraine, you can't get a baby from India, so it's very difficult to adopt abroad.
But finding a carrier, a donor egg, donor sperm, or donor embryo is actually easier than people think, and it's an investment into their family building. So I think we all need.
Absolutely, and it also doesn't have the same kind of age guidelines, right? So if you're over 40, a lot of adoption agencies won't take you, right? So as people are living longer, we have plenty of people in their 40s and early 50s who want a baby, and they're not going to be able to adopt, most likely.
So you have an agency that'll help find a carrier, is that right? Or donor egg or
Yes,
donor sperm?
yes. And
And
their embryos, there's a lot of places now that we send people to. There's places called like the Embryo Connection where they can get donor embryos too. Which, if they're using a carrier and no, but and they're a single woman using donor egg, a lot of time they using donor embryos is a lot cheaper, right? Because you're not paying to make that embryo.
right, so using donor sperm, donor egg, so essentially a donor embryo, and then finding someone to carry a baby. What's the time frame again? So start kind of. I've got the resources financially. I come to you. How long is it going to take to find that carrier and the embryos to be made, and then a transfer and.
Normally, the process is about 2 years, which is long. People a lot of times will come to us and use the agency and also use other resources to look for a carrier and bring us a carrier because so it used to be only about 3 months to find a carrier in our agency. And now it could be anywhere from, I would say, 9 months to 15 months. And that's really because of COVID. We're hoping that's going to go down a little bit. But what happened is for about 2 years, parents weren't using carriers as much. They were still using them, but not as much. And now we have a backlog from COVID of everyone coming back.
That wants a carrier, and what is the characteristics of those that want to be a carrier?
We want somebody under 45 who's had a baby before, who hasn't had any significant complications or diseases. And we want a healthy BMI, right? I mean, they can be overweight, but we don't want to see like a 45 BMI. And they have to be stable, right? So they don't have to be married, but they can't be switching apartments every 3 months. And we want to see somebody who has a stable income, that they're not going to be using this to eat or getting evicted. It's harder to become a carrier than you think. We only accept about 5% of the people that apply.
Hmm. And most people are coming, one, for the economics, the money, or for the altruism to help.
I think I mean, people have different opinions, but I think it's 50-50, right? So I always like to use the analogy of what I do for work. I love what I do, but it's my living, right? So if you told me tomorrow that I'm not getting paid, I certainly wouldn't do the same amount of it, right? So yeah, there's a subset who are 100% altruistic, and there's probably a small number who are 100% economic, but mostly it's 50-50. They enjoy being pregnant. They love the idea of helping somebody. The money is going to help them. So in general, not always, but you don't see the high income people being carriers. They tend to be, working class, could use the money, love being pregnant, love helping people. So if there's no altruism, they usually drop out because it's a lot of work.
Right. Right. And there's some risk to it. Being pregnant isn't without risk, but those that have had a history of healthy pregnancies are the primary individuals that you think are the ones that are coming forward.
Yes, I always tell people that pregnancy is not a normal state of being for the body, and people forget that when they have easy pregnancies. Technically, it's a parasite living in your body, right?
Right.
So it's going to wreak havoc on your body. Now, some people handle that better than others, but they still have to understand there's a certain percentage of people who have long term effects. And, every once in a while, somebody gets a damaged uterus after having a baby. And we have to let them know, like, you may not, probably you will be able to have children after this, but there's a small possibility you won't. And just like, people get hit by cars and die, there's a small possibility you could die. And we get all of our carriers life insurance for that reason.
And so it's something that everyone needs to think about before they move on to this area of reproduction, which is a carrier, donor egg, donor sperm, donor embryo, or any other questions regarding your reproductive needs should be directed to Melissa Brisman. And we are so grateful that you're here today with us. So thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It was wonderful.
It's always great, and we've been talking and sharing ideas for many years. I think I've been doing this for nearly 30 years now, and again, I love it. I think as much as you do, I see it and feel it. Your energy and dedication to helping people that are in need is remarkable. So thank you,
Oh,
Melissa.
thank you. Yes, I had my kids this way when when everyone told me that I was pretty much a lunatic, and now it's pretty commonplace. So it feels good, to help other people down this path.
And the intention here today is really to help people find this easier and and building your family, finding the right person to help you in this guidance is really paramount.
Yes, absolutely. And people shouldn't be are always scared of the unknown. So it's always good to have a guide, and there are so many choices of guides now, and so much information available that most people should be able to access the information they need at a relatively low cost.
And you have nearly 30 years of experience in this area. Is that right?
Yeah, actually 25, but getting close.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, that's
Yeah.
and which
I'm
is
getting
really
up there, getting old.
well, we're getting younger every day, I think, Melissa. So again,
Yeah.
thank you so much. And melissabrisman.com. Is that the way to
Yes,
place to find you?
that's very easy. Yeah.
And you can go to See My Fertility also and find Melissa's link and connection there. And really grateful you're here today. And I look forward to more communication, connection, and helping build families. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
All right. I'm going to end the broadcast.